At my son's funeral, his wife came up to me. "You have 1 week to leave the house. It's mine by law now." I smiled and quietly left. The next morning, 2 men in suits were standing at her door. "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Peggy Callahan. I'm 68 years old, and I've lived in the same White House on Maplewood Drive for 31 years. I painted the porch railings myself, planted the rose bushes along the fence, and raised my son Thomas in the bedroom with the blue curtains that still smell if you press your face into them, faintly, of the boy he used to be. Thomas was my whole world after his father, Robert, died of a heart attack 14 years ago. I don't say that with self-pity. It's simply true. He was a good man, steady, kind, a little quiet in the way that good men sometimes are. He worked in commercial real estate, drove a sensible car, called me every Sunday without fail. When he was happy, I was happy. It was that simple, and I made my peace with it being that simple. He met Dana at a conference in Columbus. She was 29 then, sharp-eyed and polished in the way of someone who has practiced being impressive. I remember the first time he brought her home for Thanksgiving. She complimented my stuffing, looked around my living room with an expression I couldn't quite name then. Not admiration, not warmth. Something more like appraisal. The way a person looks at a painting they're considering buying. I told myself I was being uncharitable. Mothers-in-law are famous for their suspicions. I swallowed my unease and passed her the cranberry sauce. They married 2 years later in a small ceremony in the backyard of this very house. I paid for the catering. Dana wore a dress that cost more than my first car. I smiled in every photograph because I loved my son, and loving him meant making room for what he chose. The first real warning sign came 6 months into the marriage. Thomas and I were having coffee on the porch, just the two of us, a Sunday morning ritual we'd kept for years. When he mentioned, a little too casually, that Dana felt the house had a lot of potential, I asked what he meant. He stirred his coffee, said she'd been looking at renovation costs, had a contractor over without telling me. I was the one living in this house. I was the one who owned this house. No one had asked me anything. When I brought it up gently with Dana that evening, she smiled. "Oh, Peggy, I just want it to be the best it can be for all of us." The words were reasonable. The smile was not quite. After that, I started noticing smaller things. Documents left open on Thomas's laptop. Not by accident, I think now. Conversations about estate planning steered cleverly toward the subject of what would happen to the house someday. Dana asking about my health with a frequency that felt clinical rather than affectionate. The way she referred to my home. Always the house, never your house, never Mom's house. Thomas did not see it. Or perhaps he saw it and could not bear what it meant. He loved her. That was plain. I did not want to be the woman who forced him to choose, so I kept quiet and watched and worried, the way mothers do. Then came March. Thomas collapsed at his office on a Tuesday afternoon. Massive stroke. He was 51 years old and perfectly healthy as far as any of us knew. By Thursday, he was gone. I will not describe those days in detail. Some grief is private enough that even words feel like a violation. What I will say is that I moved through that week in a kind of suspended state, mechanical and hollow, doing what needed to be done because there was no one else to do it. The funeral was held on a gray Saturday. Half the county came. Thomas had been liked, genuinely liked, in a way that only becomes clear at the end. I stood by the casket and shook hands and received embraces and said, "Thank you so many times the words stopped meaning anything." Dana stood beside me in a black dress that fit her perfectly. She cried at appropriate moments. She accepted condolences gracefully. She was, by every visible measure, the grieving widow. It was after the last guests had gone, while I was folding a forgotten program from one of the pewbacks, that she came to stand beside me. "Peggy." Her voice was different. The softness was gone from it. I looked up. "I want you to know," she said, "that I've already spoken to the attorney. This house, the property, everything, transfers to me. Thomas's will is clear." She paused. "Let that settle. You have 1 week to make arrangements. I think that's more than fair." The room was very quiet. I looked at her for a long moment. At the composed expression, the dry eyes, the slight tilt of her chin. And I understood, with a clarity that came slowly and then all at once, that this had been planned. Not in grief, in advance. I smiled. I don't know why I smiled. Habit, perhaps, or something colder than habit. Then I turned and walked quietly out of the room. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in the bedroom Robert and I had shared for 17 years, staring at the ceiling, listening to the old house settle around me the way it always had, the creak of the third floorboard, the tick of the radiator in the hall, and I did what I'd trained myself to do in hard moments. I thought, not about Thomas. I couldn't afford to think about Thomas yet. That would come later, in some quiet place where grief could be held at its proper size. What I thought about, that long gray night, was paper, documents, dates, what I knew and what I needed to find out. Here is what I knew. Robert and I had bought this house together in 1993. The deed was in both our names. When Robert died, I inherited his share, and the deed was updated accordingly. The house was mine, fully and legally, recorded at the county clerk's office in my name, Margray Elizabeth Callahan. Here is what I also knew. 6 years ago, when Thomas and Dana were newly engaged and I was feeling sentimental and generous in the way that loss sometimes makes you, I had added Thomas's name to the deed. Not transferred it. Added it. Joint tenancy with right of survivorship, which, as I had learned from the attorney who'd drawn up the paperwork at the time, was a very different thing from a simple title transfer. I was almost certain of what that meant. Almost. By 6 a.m, I was dressed, sitting at the kitchen table with Robert's old address book open to the page for Gerald Marsh. Gerald had handled our estate planning since 1989. He was 80 years old and mostly retired now, but he still kept an office downtown above the pharmacy, and he answered his own phone. He picked up on the second ring. "Gerald," I said, "I need an appointment today. It's about the house." There was a brief pause. "I heard about Thomas, Peggy. I'm very sorry." "Thank you. Can you see me this morning?" He could. The drive into town takes 11 minutes on a clear day. I made it in 9. The main street of Harwick, Ohio was just coming alive. The bakery unlocking its door, a postal worker loading his truck, the pharmacy putting out its sidewalk sign. I had lived in this town for 31 years. I had gone to every school board meeting, coached the reading program at the library, brought soup to half the people on my block when they were sick. And now I was driving to a lawyer's office on the morning after burying my son, because a woman I had tried to love wanted me out of my own home within the week. Gerald met me at the door in his old cardigan. His office smelled of pipe tobacco and lemon polish, the same as it had in 1989. I explained the situation, flatly, without emotion, the way I'd learned to present things in 30 years of dealing with parents and administrators and school boards. Dana's statement, the 7-day ultimatum, her claim about Thomas's will. Gerald listened with his hands folded on the desk. Then he asked me one question. "When you added Thomas to the deed, do you remember what structure we used?" Joint tenancy, I said. Right of survivorship. He was quiet for a moment. Peggy, he said, I need to pull the exact documents to be certain, but if that's correct, and I believe it is because I recall the conversation distinctly, then what happened legally when Thomas passed is not what Dana has been told or what she believes. He explained it to me carefully, the way he always had. In joint tenancy with right of survivorship, when one owner dies, their share does not pass through the estate. It does not go through the will. It transfers automatically, immediately, to the surviving joint tenant. To me, not to Dana, not through Thomas's estate. To me, directly, by operation of law. Whatever Thomas's will said, and I didn't yet know what it said, it could not override the deed structure. The house had never been solely Thomas's to leave. I sat with that for a moment. So Dana's attorney, I said slowly, may not have looked at the deed. Or looked at it and misread the tenancy type, Gerald said. It happens more often than you'd think, especially if the attorney is young and the client is telling them what they want to hear. I drove home with my hands very steady on the wheel and a plan beginning to take shape in the back of my mind. Dana thought she held all the cards. She thought I was a grieving old woman who would pack a suitcase and disappear quietly. She had not considered that I was also, underneath the grief and the gray hair and the rose bushes, a woman who had spent 30 years in rooms full of people who underestimated her. That evening, I made a list, not of emotions, not of losses. I would deal with all of that, but of tasks. Specific, sequenced, achievable tasks. First, obtain a certified copy of the current deed from the county clerk. Second, have Gerald review Thomas's will in full. Third, document every communication from Dana in writing from this point forward. Fourth, say nothing to Dana yet. I poured myself a glass of Robert's Old Bourbon. I kept one bottle, always. And I sat on the porch in the dark, and I let myself feel, just for a few minutes, the full weight of what I had lost. My son. My Sunday mornings. His voice on the phone. Then I went inside, washed the glass, and went to bed. There was work to do. Monday morning came in cold and bright, the way Ohio mornings do in March when the season hasn't quite decided what it wants to be. I was at the county clerk's office when it opened at 8:30. The clerk, a woman named Beverly, who had been in my 4th grade class about 40 years ago, handed me the certified copy of the deed with the kind of professional neutrality that didn't quite mask her sympathy. Word travels fast in Harwick. She knew about Thomas. She knew something was happening. I thanked her and drove directly to Gerald's office. We spent 2 hours going through everything. The deed confirmed exactly what Gerald had suspected. Joint tenancy, with right of survivorship, filed correctly, recorded in 1999, my name and Thomas's both listed. As surviving joint tenant, the title had reverted to me automatically at the moment of Thomas's death. It did not matter what the will said. The will operated on the estate. The house had never been part of the estate to begin with. Then we looked at the will. Thomas had worked with a different attorney, a younger man named Paul Hessler in Columbus, and the document was recent, dated just 14 months ago. That detail lodged in my mind like a splinter. 14 months ago, Thomas and Dana had been married for 3 years. They hadn't been talking about death. What had prompted an update to the will 14 months ago? The will itself was straightforward. It left the house to Dana. It left his financial accounts, his car, and his personal effects to Dana. There was a modest bequest to me, $15,000 and the contents of his childhood bedroom. That was all. Gerald and I looked at each other across the desk. He clearly believed the house was his to leave, Gerald said quietly. Yes, I said, and someone may have encouraged that belief. I didn't answer that directly. I didn't need to. But the timeline was sitting in my chest like a stone. The will updated 14 months ago. The house listed as if it were entirely Thomas's. The deed structure apparently never mentioned or examined. Either Thomas's Columbus attorney had been negligent, or someone had been very careful not to raise the question. I drove home and typed up a written record of Sunday's conversation. Dana's exact words, the time, the location, who was present. I dated it, signed it, and emailed it to Gerald as a timestamped document. Then I waited. I didn't have to wait long. Dana called Tuesday evening. Her voice had the careful warmth she deployed when she wanted something. Peggy, I just wanted to check in. I know the week is almost up and I haven't heard anything about your plans. I'm trying to be patient, but I do need to start thinking about the property. I appreciate you calling, Dana, I said. I've been in touch with an attorney. A pause, short, but I heard it. Oh, good. Then you understand the situation. I'm starting to, I said. Another pause, longer. Is there something you'd like to tell me? Not yet, I said. I'll be in touch. I hung up. I could hear, in the silence after, that she was rattled. She had expected tears or pleading or quiet compliance. She had not expected an attorney and a measured voice, and not yet. The following morning, Gerald called me back with something he'd found while reviewing documents. He had reached out to a colleague who knew Paul Hessler, the Columbus attorney who'd drawn up the will. The colleague, cautiously and without violating privilege, mentioned that the will had been initiated by Dana, that she had called the office, scheduled the appointment, and been present throughout the meeting. Thomas had signed, yes, but the process had been organized and directed by his wife. I sat down at the kitchen table. It wasn't illegal. A spouse could absolutely arrange an estate planning appointment. But when I laid it alongside the deed that Dana's version of events required everyone to ignore, a picture came into focus that was cold and deliberate and had been drawn long before Thomas died. She had known about the will. She had shaped the will. Whether she had ever checked the deed or had hoped it would go unexamined in the confusion of grief, I couldn't say for certain. But she had walked up to me at my son's funeral with a 7-day deadline and legal language, and she had been neither surprised nor grieving in that moment. She had been prepared. I went to the porch and stood in the cold air for a long time, looking at Robert's rose bushes, winter bare and stark against the fence. There would be no negotiating with this woman. There would be no family conversation, no mediated settlement, no appeal to sentiment. She had decided, somewhere along the way, that I was an obstacle to be removed, and she had been patient about it. So I would be patient too. I went back inside and called Gerald. I'm ready to proceed, I said. With what specifically? With everything. The letter went out on Thursday. Gerald drafted it on his old letterhead. Heavy cream paper, black ink, the kind of document that communicates seriousness before you've read a word. It was addressed to Dana Callahan and copied to Paul Hessler, the Columbus attorney who had prepared Thomas's will. The letter was 4 pages long, precise, and entirely without anger. It stated, with attached documentation, that the property at 412 Maplewood Drive, Harwick, Ohio, was held in joint tenancy with right of survivorship between Robert J. Callahan, deceased 2010, his interest having passed at that time, and Margaret E. Callahan. Upon Thomas's death, his interest, which had itself been added by Mrs. Callahan as a gift, reverted automatically to Mrs. Callahan as sole surviving joint tenant. The property had never been part of Thomas Callahan's estate and could not be devised by will. Any claim to the property through. The estate was legally without foundation. The letter further noted that Mrs. Callahan had been verbally instructed to vacate her home within 7 days, and that this instruction constituted, at minimum, a tortious interference with her property rights. It requested written confirmation within 5 business days that Dana Callahan and her counsel understood and accepted the legal reality of the title situation. Failure to respond appropriately would result in further action. I mailed it myself. Certified mail return receipt requested. I kept the tracking number in my wallet. Friday passed quietly. Saturday, too. Then Sunday morning, a car I didn't recognize pulled up in front of the house, a silver sedan, rental plates. And Dana stepped out, alone, no attorney, no warning call. I watched through the kitchen window for a moment. Then I put down my coffee and went to the front door. She looked different than she had at the funeral. The composure was still there, surface level, but underneath it, something was tight and electric. She was wearing sunglasses even though it was overcast. "Can I come in?" "No," I said. I kept my voice pleasant. Her jaw tightened. "Peggy, we need to talk about this letter." "My attorney is available Monday through Friday," I said. "Gerald Marsh, you have his number." This is a family matter. She said the word family the way someone uses a word they've looked up but never quite felt. "You're doing this out of spite." "I'm asserting my legal rights to my home," I said. "Those aren't the same thing." "You think you can just—" She stopped, recalibrated. "You know Thomas wanted me to have this house. You know that." "Thomas may have believed the house was entirely his to leave," I said quietly. "He may have been given that impression." Something shifted in her face. "Don't," she said. "I haven't said anything, Dana." She stepped closer. The pleasantness was gone entirely now. "You have no idea what you're starting. I have resources. I have a very good attorney in Columbus, and I will contest this in court and make it drag for years, and I promise you that will cost you more than this house is worth." I looked at her for a long moment. The rose bushes were behind her, gray and bare. The street was quiet. "You're welcome to try," I said. "Is there anything else?" She stood there for a few seconds more, and I could see her recalculating, running through the options, looking for a lever she hadn't used yet. She didn't find one. She went back to her car. She drove away without looking at the house. I went inside and sat down at the kitchen table and let my hands shake because they wanted to. I had been calm through that entire conversation, and now my body wanted to acknowledge what it had cost. I let it. That evening, I called Gerald. He'd received a call from Paul Hessler, who had apparently reviewed the deed documentation with considerably more attention than before. Hessler had been quiet on the phone, Gerald said, and professional, and given nothing away. But he had not been dismissive. "She'll come back," I told Gerald. "Yes," he said, "but we're on solid ground." After I hung up, I did something I hadn't done since Thomas's funeral. I left the house. I drove to the state park outside of town and walked the trail along the reservoir for 2 hours, alone, in the cold March air. I looked at the water. I thought about Thomas as a boy, how he used to skip stones here and could never quite get the technique right, laughing at himself without embarrassment, the way kind people do. I let myself grieve properly, without an agenda. Then I went home and slept for 9 hours straight, and in the morning I felt, if not whole, then at least solid again. The temptation came through Carol Briggs. Carol was the wife of Thomas's former business partner, a woman I'd known for 15 years, pleasant enough, the sort of person who appears at church every Sunday and at every funeral, and whose loyalty I had always privately suspected was largely to whoever was most useful at a given moment. She called me on a Wednesday, 2 weeks after the letter had gone out, and asked if she could stop by for coffee. I said yes because I wanted to see what Dana was doing. Carol arrived with a store-bought coffee cake and a careful expression and sat across from me at the kitchen table with the look of someone who had rehearsed their opening. She asked how I was. I told her I was managing. She told me Thomas had been such a wonderful man. I agreed. Then she set down her fork and said, "Peggy, I wonder if you've thought about whether all of this is really worth the fight." "All of what?" I asked. "The legal situation. Dana is willing to be flexible, you know." She mentioned to me, and I'm only sharing this because I care about you both, she mentioned that she'd be open to a cash settlement. Something fair. Maybe enough for you to find a lovely little place somewhere. A condo, perhaps. Something easier to maintain at your... She stopped. "At my age," I said. Carol had the grace to look slightly embarrassed. "She's authorized you to make this offer?" I asked. "Oh, I wouldn't say authorized. More that she mentioned it in conversation, and I thought..." "Carol," I said, "if Dana has a formal offer to make, she can have her attorney send it to Gerald Marsh in writing." I refilled her coffee. "How is Jim?" We talked about Jim for another 20 minutes, and Carol went home with most of the coffee cake uneaten. I watched her car back out of the driveway and thought, a condo, easier to maintain. Dana had sized me up as a woman who could be softened with convenience and the implication of her own frailty. She had misjudged again, but the visit crystallized something for me. I was carrying this alone, and I didn't need to. That week, I called people. First, I called my neighbor Dorothy, who had lived 3 houses down for 22 years and had watched Thomas grow up. Dorothy was 73, sharp, and had worked as a paralegal for 2 decades before her retirement. Over coffee, I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. At the end, she said, "You need character witnesses and community presence. You have both." Then she offered to organize a rotating check-in. Neighbors who would simply be visible, around, watching. Not in a threatening way, just present. Small-town presence, which is its own kind of power. Then I called Pastor Hugh at Harwick Methodist, who had done Thomas's funeral. Hugh was a practical man who had counseled hundreds of families through estate disputes. He didn't give me legal advice, but he gave me something else. He sat with me for an hour and said, very gently, that grief and strategy could coexist, that protecting what was mine was not a betrayal of Thomas's memory, and that I should not let anyone make me feel that it was. I hadn't known until he said it that I'd needed to hear it. Finally, I called my daughter-in-law's sister. This requires explanation. Dana had a sister, Karen, who had been at the wedding and had afterward drifted out of contact. I had always assumed at Dana's instigation. Karen had sent me a handwritten condolence note after Thomas's death, which had surprised me enough that I'd kept it. The note was warm and genuine and included her phone number with a small penciled message. "If you ever need anything." She answered on the first ring. When I told her what Dana had done at the funeral, there was a long silence. "That sounds exactly like her," Karen said finally. "I'm so sorry, Peggy." We talked for an hour. Karen shared nothing I could use legally, but she confirmed the shape of a person I was already beginning to see clearly. A woman for whom relationships were instruments, for whom sentiment was performance, for whom other people's homes and histories were simply assets to be acquired. That evening I sat on the porch as the sun went down, and for the first time since Thomas died, I did not feel entirely alone. The house was still mine. My neighbors knew it. My pastor knew it, my attorney knew it, and somewhere in Columbus, Dana Callahan was waiting for me to run out of will. She would be waiting a long time. She came on a Saturday in April, when the first green was just beginning to show on the rose canes along the fence. I was in the garden when her car pulled up. The same silver sedan, same rental plates, which told me the Columbus apartment Dana had retreated to was not yet permanent enough for her own car. She was dressed differently this time. Softer. A gray cardigan, her hair down, no sunglasses. She was carrying something, a white bakery box tied with twine. I stood up from the rose bed and waited. "I thought we should talk," she said. "Properly this time, without attorneys." She held up the box. "I brought those lemon pastries you like, from Hennessy's." She had paid attention to the lemon pastries. She had filed that away at some point during the years she'd visited this house, and now she was deploying it. That was the word that came to me, standing in the garden with dirt on my gloves. Deploying. Not offering. Not sharing. Deploying the way you deploy a tool. "Come around to the back porch," I said. We sat at the old table where I had had Sunday morning coffee with Thomas for 15 years. Dana set out the pastries on the paper and folded her hands and looked at me with an expression she'd calibrated carefully, somewhere between grief and appeal. She was good at this. I could acknowledge that, even then. "Peggy," she said, "I think we've both been handling this badly. I was out of my mind at the funeral. I said things I shouldn't have. I was grieving." I waited. "And I understand there are some deed complications. Paul has explained it to me." She paused, letting the word complications do its quiet work, reducing what was actually a clear legal reality to something murky, contestable, manageable. "I'm not trying to take your home." "That's a different position than the one you took 3 weeks ago," I said. "I know, and I'm sorry." The apology was smooth, rehearsed, delivered with the right amount of eye contact. "But I need you to understand something. Thomas and I, we had plans. For this house. Together. It was going to be our home. Our family home." She let that word hang. Family. In the April air between us. "And I think, if you're honest with yourself, you know that he wanted me to have it." "Thomas loved you," I said. "I don't doubt that." Then, but he was also, by the time that will was written, working with information someone had given him about what he owned. I kept my voice level. "I'm not making accusations. I'm telling you what the documents show." Her expression changed. Something slid beneath the surface of it, like ice shifting under pressure you can't quite see. That's a terrible thing to say." "Is it inaccurate? You're implying that I manipulated my husband." Her voice was beginning to lose its softness. "That I arranged his will. That I somehow—" She stopped, took a breath, steadied herself with visible effort. "Peggy, I loved Thomas. We built a life together. And if you go through with this, you're going to drag his name through a legal dispute. His reputation. His memory. Is that really what you want? To reduce him to a court filing?" There it was, laid out flat on the table between the lemon pastries. She had pivoted, cleanly and deliberately, from sentiment to threat. The logic was simple. Love your son's memory more than you love your rights. It was the most sophisticated version of what she'd been doing since the funeral, using Thomas as a lever to move me. She had learned, apparently, that direct pressure hadn't worked, and so now she was trying something more refined. "What I want," I said quietly, "is to remain in my home. The home I have owned for 31 years. The home where I raised your husband and planted those rose bushes and painted that porch twice with my own hands and buried his father from this front door." I paused, then added, "Thomas's memory does not require me to give up what is legally mine. Those two things are not in conflict, and all you have to do to avoid a very public, very ugly court case," she said, The warmth was gone entirely now, the mask in pieces around her, and I could see the exhaustion beneath it, the frustration of someone whose best tool had just failed. Is withdraw the deed claim. I'll give you the 15,000 from the will. You can go somewhere nice. I'm trying to be generous here, Peggy. I am genuinely trying. You're trying to be expedient, I said. There's a difference. She stood up. The chair scraped back sharply on the porch boards. The pastry box was still open on the table, untouched by either of us. You know what I think? I think you were always jealous of us, of what Thomas and I had together. I think you couldn't stand that he chose someone, had his own life, moved beyond this house and this town, and— Dana, I said, you should leave now. And now you're hiding behind some deed technicality because you can't accept that he loved me and chose me and wanted me to have— Leave, please. She stopped. Something worked in her jaw. She looked around the back porch, at the worn chairs, the table with its ring stains from 30 years of coffee mugs, the garden, the house itself. With an expression so unguarded, I could see exactly what was underneath everything. Not grief, not love, not even truly anger, but a frustrated, furious greed that had been denied at every turn and could not understand why. She had believed herself patient and clever and entitled, and she had run into a wall she hadn't anticipated. Then she walked back around the side of the house to her car without another word. I heard the engine start, and then the sound fading down Maplewood Drive. I sat at the table after she was gone. The lemon pastries sat in their box. I didn't touch them. After a while, I got up, closed the box carefully, and put it in the trash. Not because the pastries had done anything wrong, but because I did not want them in my kitchen. I won't pretend I was fearless. There was a cold thread of fear running through me, not of Dana exactly, but of what she was willing to do, of the things she'd said about dragging Thomas's memory into court, of the grinding months that might still lie ahead. She had struck at something real, the idea that protecting myself might cost Thomas something. I would be lying if I said that hadn't landed. But the fear did something unexpected. Instead of hollowing me out, it clarified me. It burned away the last of my hesitation. I thought of Robert. I thought of Thomas skipping stones at the reservoir, laughing at himself. I thought of the rose bushes I'd planted the year we moved in, how they'd come back every spring without fail, bare canes turning suddenly, stubbornly, beautifully green. Not because conditions were perfect, but simply because that is what they were built to do. I went inside and called Gerald. She came, I said. She tried the quiet approach first, then emotional leverage around Thomas's memory, then a veiled threat about court, then a cash offer. Did she make any new legal claims? No, she wanted me to voluntarily withdraw the deed assertion. Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then she knows her legal position is weak, he said. People only offer money when they've stopped believing they can win. Yes, I said, I believe she has. The hearing was set for the second Tuesday in May. It was not a full trial. Gerald had filed a quiet title action, a specific legal proceeding to have the court officially confirm what the documents already showed, that the house at 412 Maplewood Drive was mine, unencumbered, and could not be claimed through Thomas's estate. Quiet title actions are, by their nature, procedural and undramatic. They are decided on documentation, on the chain of ownership, on recorded fact. I had all of those things. Dana had retained Paul Hessler directly now, no longer just as the will's author, but as her active legal counsel in the dispute. Gerald had heard through professional channels that she'd also consulted 2 other Columbus attorneys in the preceding weeks. both of whom had apparently declined to take the case on its merits. That detail told me what I needed to know about how the legal community viewed her position. Attorneys who believe in a case take the case. The night before the hearing, I did something I hadn't done in perhaps 20 years. I went to the blue bedroom, Thomas's room, and I sat on the edge of the bed in the dark for a while. Not to grieve, not exactly. More to be close to something. To remind myself what this was actually about. It wasn't about winning. It was about the right of a person to remain in the place they had built their life, among the evidence of everything they had loved. I slept well that night, better than I'd expected. The courthouse in Harwick is a small, 2-story stone building that smells of old carpet and copying paper, and the particular stillness of rooms where consequential things are decided quietly. I'd been inside it twice in my life. Once for jury duty in the 90s, once when Robert and I filed papers years ago. I arrived 15 minutes early, with Gerald beside me, the deed documentation in a manila folder, and the kind of calm that comes not from the absence of fear, but from having lived with it long enough that it no longer has the same authority. Dorothy was in the public gallery. She had come without being asked, had simply appeared in her good coat, sitting straight-backed in the second row. I saw her when I turned around, and she gave me a small, firm nod that said everything it needed to say. 2 other neighbors were there as well, Jim and Patricia Holden, who had lived across the street for 18 years and whose children had grown up alongside Thomas. They hadn't mentioned they were coming. They had simply come. That is the thing about a community you have actually built, I thought. It shows up. Donna arrived with Hessler 6 minutes before the hearing began. She was composed, well-dressed, a dark blazer, her hair pinned back, the mask fully reinstated after the disorder of the porch conversation 2 weeks prior. She did not look at me when she entered. Hessler gave Gerald a professional nod, the kind that means nothing personally. Judge Eleanor Whitmore, ran the hearing briskly. She was 65, gray-haired, with reading glasses she wore on a chain, and the bearing of a woman who had presided over this courtroom for many years and had long since stopped being impressed by anything that came before her. She had the particular quality of good judges. She listened completely, and she was impossible to perform for. Gerald presented the deed first, the original joint tenancy document from 1999, the chain of title going back to the original purchase in 1993, the clear survivorship language, the legal consequence of that structure. He was methodical and unhurried. He had done this for 50 years. Hessler had filed a written response arguing that Thomas had been unaware of the tenancy structure when the will was drafted, and that his clear testamentary intent, his expressed wish that Dana receive the property, should be given equitable consideration by the court. It was the strongest argument available to him, which is to say, it was not very strong, but it was what he had. Judge Whitmore set down Hessler's filing and looked over her glasses. "Mrs. Callahan," she said, addressing Dana directly, "when did you first become aware of the joint tenancy structure of the deed on this property?" Dana said, clearly and without hesitation, that she had only recently learned of it through the current proceedings. The judge made a note. "And the will in question was drawn up 14 months ago?" Hessler confirmed that. "At that time," the judge said, "in the course of preparing the will, did you or your counsel review the existing deed documentation for the property?" Another pause. Hessler said that the client had described the property as belonging to her husband. "Mrs. Callahan described it as belonging to her husband," Judge Whitmore repeated, not inflecting it as a question, just letting it sit. "And you did not independently verify the title at that time?" The silence that followed was complete and informative. Then Gerald rose and introduced the email. I had not known he had it until that morning, when he'd called at 7:30 and said, carefully, that Karen had provided something through proper channels that he believed was relevant and admissible. He had been right on both counts. The email was 2 years old. Dana had sent it to Karen from her personal account. A casual message about various plans and thoughts, the kind of email people write when they are confident and unguarded. In it, Dana had referenced the Harwick property and used the phrase, "that old deed structure she set up with Robert," in the context of discussing what the house might eventually be worth. She had known. Not recently, not through these proceedings. 2 years before Thomas died, she had known the deed structure existed and had not disclosed it to Thomas's attorney and had not disclosed it to Thomas. She had known, and she had kept the knowledge to herself, and she had arranged a will that depended on everyone else not knowing. When Gerald read the relevant portion aloud in that quiet courtroom, I did not look at Dana. I looked straight ahead. But I heard the sound she made. A sharp, involuntary intake of breath, almost inaudible. "That's taken out of context," she said, loudly enough that Judge Whitmore looked up from her papers. "Mrs. Callahan," the judge said, with the patience of someone who has heard everything, "please address your comments through your counsel. She kept this from Thomas. She knew, and she never told him, and now she's using her own." "Mrs. Callahan." The judge's voice did not rise. It hardened. Hessler put his hand on Dana's arm. She shook it off with a sharp motion that was visible to everyone in the room. Her composure was gone, not cracked, but shattered, the pieces visible. Her face was flushed. She was breathing in the shallow, rapid way of someone who has just watched the ground disappear beneath a plan they had been certain was solid. "She manipulated him," Dana said, lower now, but still audible, her voice unsteady, with something that sounded almost like genuine disbelief. The disbelief of someone who had genuinely never considered that things might not go her way. She manipulated the whole. "Mrs. Callahan, I will ask you one final time to be quiet, or I will remove you from this proceeding and note your conduct in the record." The room went still. Dana sat down. Hessler leaned toward her and spoke quietly, urgently, the words inaudible, but the tone clear. "Stop, stop. There is nothing left to save here by speaking." Judge Whitmore removed her reading glasses and set them on the bench, and looked at both sides with the calm expression of a woman delivering a conclusion she had reached some time ago. "I will issue my ruling in writing within 30 days, she said. "I will tell both counsel now, however, that the deed documentation before this court is unambiguous. The right of survivorship operates by law, not by intent, and equitable arguments require extraordinary circumstances that have not been demonstrated here." She paused. "What has been demonstrated today raises additional questions that I intend to refer to the appropriate authorities for their consideration." She looked at Hessler when she said that. Not at Dana. At Hessler. He did not look up from the table. Court was adjourned. Outside on the courthouse steps, the May morning was brilliant, warm, generous, the kind of Ohio spring day that feels like it has been specifically arranged to make you glad to be alive. Dorothy was beside me before I'd reached the bottom step. Behind her came Jim and Patricia, and then 2 women from the library program, and then Pastor Hugh, who had apparently also come quietly and said nothing about it. I stood in the sunlight with these people around me, and I breathed in and out, slowly and deliberately, the way you breathe when something large has ended, and you need a moment before the next thing begins. Behind me, through the heavy courthouse doors, I could hear Donna's voice. Raised, broken, the careful architecture of her completely gone. and Hessler's lower tones working steadily to contain her. I did not turn around. There was nothing behind me that required my attention anymore. The ruling came on a Thursday, 31 days after the hearing. Gerald called me at 9 in the morning. He read the key language to me over the phone, in his measured, unhurried voice. The court finds that the property located at 412 Maplewood Drive, Harwick, Ohio, is vested solely in the name of Margaret Elizabeth Callahan by operation of the right of survivorship under the joint tenancy deed recorded in 1999. The property was not and could not be part of the estate of Thomas Robert Callahan. Any claims to the contrary are without legal merit and are hereby dismissed. He paused. "Congratulations, Peggy," he said. I sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd sat the morning after the funeral, alone at 6 o'clock with Robert's address book open in front of me. And I let the words settle into me. The house is mine. The house has always been mine. The document now said so in language that could not be revised or disputed or managed by a better attorney. It was over. But the consequences were not finished yet. Judge Whitmore, as promised, had referred her concerns to the Ohio State Bar Association. The referral concerned Paul Hessler's failure to independently verify title before drafting a will that purported to transfer property he had not confirmed was his client's to transfer. I did not know at the time Gerald called exactly where that would lead. I would learn over the following months that Hessler received a formal reprimand and was required to complete additional professional education. He did not lose his license, but the reprimand was public record. His practice in Columbus contracted noticeably in the year that followed. As for Dana, without the house, which she had apparently intended to sell, based on a listing consultation she'd had with a Columbus realtor in February, 2 weeks before Thomas's death, which Karen eventually shared with me. Her financial situation was considerably more complicated than she'd anticipated. Thomas's life insurance had named her as beneficiary, and she received that. His car, his accounts, the contents of the house they'd rented in Columbus, all of that was hers. But the money she'd counted on from the sale of a property in Harwick's rising market was not coming. The details of what happened to Dana over the months that followed came to me in fragments, through Karen, through people who knew people in Columbus. And I will not pretend I was indifferent to them. I am human, and she had tried to take my home 9 days after I buried my son. But I did not seek those details out. I made a choice, somewhere in that period, to face forward. There was one final communication from Dana 6 weeks after the ruling. It came as a text message, my number apparently still in her phone, sent at 11:47 on a weeknight. It was not coherent, and it was not kind. It contained accusations and language I won't repeat, and a final declaration that I was a bitter, lonely woman who had destroyed Thomas's legacy out of spite. I read it once. Then I put my phone down, made myself a cup of chamomile tea, and sat on the porch in the evening air. I thought about what a response would cost me. The time, the energy, the reopening of something I had worked very hard to close. I thought about what Dana was doing, alone at midnight, sending a message like that, and what that said about what her victory had and hadn't been. I did not respond. The next morning I blocked the number. That was the last I heard from Dana Callahan. The house was quiet around me, the way it had always been. The third floorboard creaking, the radiator ticking in the hall, the rose bushes outside doing whatever rose bushes do in the dark when no one is watching. Returning. Always returning. Summer came. I had the porch repainted. Not because it needed it exactly, but because I wanted to mark the beginning of something. To do something with my hands that was about making rather than defending. I chose the same white as always, but with a soft gray for the trim I'd been thinking about for years. Robert's color, nearly. He'd always liked that gray. Dorothy came over when I was finishing the trim and brought iced tea and sat on the steps and talked with me in the easy way of old friends who have been through something together. We talked about Thomas, about Robert, about the town. Normal things. Life-sized things. I went back to the library that summer. I had run the adult literacy program there for 12 years before semi-retiring, and they had been limping along with reduced hours. I offered to come back twice a week. By September, we had 9 students and a waiting list. I planted a kitchen garden along the side of the house. Tomatoes, basil, 3 kinds of lettuce. Using seeds I'd been saving in a tin on the windowsill for years, always meaning to use them. The tomatoes were spectacular. I brought bags of them to neighbors and to the church and kept a bowl full on the kitchen table until October. In August, my cousin Elaine came from Tennessee for 2 weeks and stayed in the blue bedroom, Thomas's old room, and we stayed up late every night talking and laughing in a way I hadn't done in years. She said on her last night that I seemed lighter than before, more like myself. I think she was right. News of Dana came occasionally, without my seeking it. Karen called every month or 2. We had developed out of all of this an unexpected friendship. Through her, I learned that Dana had moved twice in the year after the ruling, first to a smaller Columbus apartment, then to Cincinnati. There had been a relationship that didn't last, a job that ended. The arc of it was not triumphant. I didn't gloat, or I tried not to. I've decided not to judge myself too harshly for that. What I felt, more than satisfaction, was something quieter. A sense that choices had produced their natural consequences the way they generally do, given enough time. She had treated people as instruments, planned around a death, looked at a woman's home and seen only an asset. Those were not mistakes of strategy. She had been quite strategic, but of character. And character tends to catch up. The rose bushes bloomed in June, late, as they sometimes are after a hard spring, full and extravagant, the way they do when properly tended. Thomas would have stood at the kitchen window with his coffee and looked at them and said something understated and pleased. I let myself imagine that in the mornings. It wasn't grief exactly by that point. It was memory, which is grief that has found a place to live. I was 68 years old, and I was home. They counted on my grief making me passive. They were wrong. Here is what I learned. Your name on a deed is not just paper. It is your history, your labor, your life made tangible. Know what you own. Keep your documents. Find your Gerald. And never, ever mistake quiet for weakness. I lost my son. Nothing undoes that. But I did not lose my home, my dignity, or myself. Those things I fought for and kept. If someone handed you a 7-day eviction notice at your child's funeral, what would you have done? Leave a comment. Share this with someone who needs it. Thank you for listening.